Singapore, February 23, 1995. A fax arrives at the London headquarters of Barings Bank. It is one sentence long. It reads, "I am sorry." No explanation, no figures, no forwarding address. Just those three words, and a signature. Nicholas Leeson. By the time the bank's directors finished reading it, Barings, the oldest merchant bank in Britain, the institution that once financed the Napoleonic Wars, the bank that held accounts for the Queen herself, was functionally dead. It would be purchased the following day for £1 sterling. What happened in that building and what happened inside that man is not a story about greed. It is a story about a trap that the human mind builds for itself, piece by piece, decision by decision, until escape becomes impossible. And the trap was elegant. To understand what Leeson did, you first have to understand what Barings was. Not what it had been, what it still was in 1992, when a 25-year-old clerk from Watford walked into its Singapore office and asked to be made a trader. Barings was founded in 1762. It survived the South Sea Bubble. It survived 2 world wars. It survived the Great Depression. For 2.5 centuries, through every financial catastrophe the modern world produced, Barings endured. It was not the largest bank in London. It was something more dangerous than large. It was trusted. Nick Leeson arrived in that environment with a particular set of qualities that institutions like Barings tend to misprice. He was not educated in the usual way, no Oxbridge degree, no city pedigree. What he had was arithmetic fluency, an unusual tolerance for ambiguity, and a salesman's read on what people want to believe. He also had something that proved decisive. He understood back-office operations. He had worked settlements, the unglamorous, procedural side of finance, where trades are confirmed, errors are reconciled, and records are kept. Most traders never touch that side of the business. They generate positions. Other people clean them up. Leeson knew both rooms. When Barings sent him to Singapore to set up their futures trading operation on the SIMEX, the Singapore International Monetary Exchange, they gave him something almost without precedent: dual authority. He was both the head trader and the head of back-office settlements. He was in effect the person who made the trades and the person who recorded the trades. Whoever designed that structure, and several people approved it, created a loop with no external auditor, a closed system. The mathematics of fraud require exactly one thing: that no one outside the loop can see inside it. Barings had just provided that condition voluntarily to a 25-year-old with a secondary school education and an appetite for the work. There is a question worth sitting with. Did anyone at Barings London know what they had built? The answer, based on what we now know from the subsequent investigations, is that they did not. They saw profits, extraordinary profits. A young trader in Singapore generating returns that made the entire London operation look slow. When someone is making you money, the incentive to ask how is structurally low. That dynamic, money flowing up, questions flowing nowhere, is not unique to Barings. It is a feature of hierarchies under performance pressure. It is also, as we will see, precisely what Leeson was counting on. Here is where most accounts of this story go wrong. They present Leeson's scheme as a plan, as if on some specific day he decided to build a fraud. That is not what happened. What happened was more interesting and more instructive. It began in 1992 with a small error made by someone else. A junior trader on Leeson's team, a woman who had recently joined, entered a trade incorrectly. The resulting loss was approximately £20,000, a rounding error by Barings standards, an embarrassment but not a catastrophe. Leeson made a decision that seemed, in the moment, entirely reasonable. He would absorb the loss into a dormant account, account 8888, rather than report it immediately. He would make the money back through trades. He would correct the error before anyone noticed. The account would zero out. No harm done. That decision, that one act of concealment, made to protect a junior colleague from a manageable mistake, was the first step into a room with no door. Account 8888 was not new. It had been opened during the setup of the Singapore operation as a technical error account, a legitimate administrative tool for recording minor booking mistakes that needed to be cleared before end-of-day reconciliation. It had internal visibility, but was specifically configured not to transmit to Barings London in daily position reports. Leeson knew this. He had set it up. So the mechanics were already in place, a hidden account, legitimately structured, that sat below the threshold of London's attention. All Leeson had to do was use it differently than intended. This is the architectural insight that deserves examination. The most durable schemes in financial history rarely require entirely new infrastructure. They work by repurposing existing infrastructure, structures already trusted, already invisible to auditors because their original function was benign. Account 8888 was not built for fraud. It became the vehicle for fraud because it already had the necessary property, invisibility. By 1993, the account was no longer holding a £20,000 rounding error. It was holding losses in the tens of millions. And here is where the psychology becomes precise. Leeson was not a reckless gambler by temperament. People who worked with him described him as methodical, controlled. He understood the mathematics of derivatives trading at a level that most of his London superiors did not. He knew exactly how large the losses were. He knew the account balance to the penny. The question is, why did he not stop? The answer requires understanding what kind of instrument he was trading. Leeson was dealing primarily in Nikkei 225 futures on CIMEX, contracts that allowed him to bet on the direction of the Japanese stock market. He was also selling options, specifically straddles, which are positions that profit when markets stay calm and lose when markets move sharply in either direction. The logic was coherent. Japan's economy was large. Its market was liquid. Its volatility was historically moderate. Selling straddles on a stable market is not irrational. Under normal conditions, it generates consistent, predictable income. Leeson was not making random bets. He was making a structured argument about the future behavior of a market he knew well. The argument was wrong, but it was not stupid. And now, here is the detail that the standard narrative almost always omits. The longer the losses sat in account 88888, the more Leeson was trapped by a mechanical constraint that had nothing to do with psychology. Derivatives positions require margin, cash collateral posted against potential losses. As Leeson's hidden losses grew, he needed to post increasing amounts of margin to CIMEX to keep his positions open. That margin had to come from somewhere. It came from Barings London. Leeson was receiving transfers, hundreds of millions of pounds, from Barings' treasury, sent in response to margin calls that London understood to be routine operational requirements. As far as London could tell, Singapore was engaged in client arbitrage, a low-risk, high-volume strategy that naturally required large capital flows. In 1994 alone, Barings transferred approximately £354 million to Singapore. London thought they were funding profitable client trades. They were funding the margin requirements of a hidden loss position that was growing every day. The machine had taken on its own momentum. Leeson could not close his positions without crystallizing losses that would immediately destroy the bank. He could not stop receiving margin transfers without triggering questions. He could not reveal the account without ending everything. So he did the only thing the system he had built left room for. He doubled down. By January 1995, Leeson held futures contracts on approximately 61,000 Nikkei lots, an exposure representing notional value in excess of $7 billion. To put that in context, the combined capital of Barings Bank at the time was approximately £470 million. He was running a position more than 12 times the size of the entire bank, and he was betting one direction, that the Nikkei would rise, or at minimum hold steady. His reasoning was not incoherent. The Japanese market had shown resilience. There was no specific catalyst for a sharp move downward. Every model he had, and the models were good, told him the bet was defensible. There was, however, one variable that no financial model can price: the Earth. January 17, 1995, 05:46 local time. The Great Hanshin earthquake strikes the city of Kobe, Japan. Magnitude 6.9. Duration approximately 20 seconds. Confirmed deaths 6,434 people. This is not a story about the earthquake. The earthquake is not the villain. It is not even, in the conventional sense, the cause of what followed. It is the moment when mathematics became irreversible. The Nikkei's response to the Kobe earthquake was immediate and severe. The market dropped sharply on the news. By January 23rd, 6 days after the quake, it had fallen more than 1,000 points from its pre-earthquake level. For Leeson's positions, this was catastrophic in a precise, calculable way. Every 100-point drop in the Nikkei represented a loss of approximately $70 million against his long futures exposure. The account that had held tens of millions in losses now held losses in the hundreds of millions. And Leeson made a decision that from the outside looks like panic. From the inside, from inside the logic he had been living in for 3 years, it was the only rational move available. He doubled down. By January 17th and February 23rd, the 37 days between the earthquake and his letter of resignation, Leeson accumulated an additional 20,000 Nikkei futures contracts. He was attempting to hold the market up, or more precisely, he was attempting to create the appearance of institutional buying interest in the hope that other participants would follow, that sentiment would shift, that the index would recover. This is not as irrational as it sounds. Large institutional purchases do move markets. Leeson's positions were large enough to have measurable price impact. For brief periods during those weeks, his buying did slow the decline. But the earthquake was not a sentiment problem. It was an economic reality.
Kobe was Japan's sixth largest city and one of its most critical manufacturing and port hubs. The physical destruction of infrastructure does not reverse because a futures trader buys contracts in Singapore. The market could feel the pressure. It could not yield to it. Meanwhile, in London, there were signals. The margin calls from Singapore had escalated to a scale that was difficult to explain under any normal operational model. An internal audit inquiry had been opened. A senior manager had sent a memo flagging concerns about Leeson's dual role, the same structural problem that had existed for 3 years without being corrected. There was also a growing unease among certain people at Barings London who understood derivatives well enough to know that the reported profits from Singapore did not make mathematical sense. The positions Leeson claimed to be running, hedged arbitrage, low risk, would not generate the kind of returns he was posting. But knowing something is wrong and being able to prove it inside an institution where the anomaly is generating profit are two very different things. The incentive structure of the institution actively resisted its own examination. By mid-February, the Nikkei had not recovered. It continued to decline. Leeson's total hidden losses were now approaching £800 million. Barings Bank had, at this point, more capital tied up in Nick Leeson's margin requirements than it had in its entire capitalization. There was no path forward, not mathematically. On February 23rd, Leeson left his office in Singapore, drove to the airport with his wife, and sent the fax. "I am sorry." He was 28 years old. The subsequent ING acquisition and regulatory investigation revealed the full picture. Account 88888 had accumulated losses of £827 million, twice the bank's available capital. Barings was insolvent. It was sold to ING for £1. Over 1,200 people lost their jobs. Thousands of pensioners who held Barings products experienced losses they did not recover for years. Leeson was extradited from Germany, where he was arrested attempting to return to Britain. He was tried in Singapore and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. He was released in 1999 after serving 4 years, having been diagnosed and treated for colon cancer while incarcerated. He is alive. He has written about what happened. He lectures on the psychology of trading risk. And what he describes in those lectures and in his writing is not what most people expect to hear. Here is the insight. Sit with this one. Leeson did not become irrational. At every step, from the first concealment in 1992 to the final desperate buying spree in January 1995, his decisions were logical responses to the situation as he understood it. The problem was not that he stopped thinking clearly. The problem was that each decision, being locally rational, made the next decision harder to escape. Psychologists call this escalation of commitment. It is sometimes called the sunk cost fallacy, though that framing is slightly misleading, because in Leeson's case, stopping would not merely mean accepting a loss. It would mean accepting a loss so large that it would destroy the institution he worked for and everyone connected to it. The cost of stopping was catastrophic, and the cost of continuing was also catastrophic. But continuing preserved the possibility, however remote, of a recovery. Stopping did not. This is the precise structure of what researchers call an entrapment spiral. Stage 1, a commitment is made. It seems reasonable. Stage 2, initial results are negative, but the investment already made creates pressure to continue. Stage 3. Additional resources are committed to justify prior resources. Stage 4. The gap between invested resources and recoverable value becomes unbridgeable, but the decision maker cannot acknowledge this without also acknowledging the full weight of every prior decision. The commitment is no longer to the outcome. The commitment is to the story of the self that made the original decision. This is not unique to financial fraud. It operates in wars. Governments continue campaigns long after the strategic rationale has collapsed, because acknowledging that collapse means acknowledging the cost of every prior battle. It operates in relationships. People remain in circumstances that no longer serve them because leaving would require admitting that earlier choices were wrong. It operates in organizations. Companies pursue failing product lines, failing acquisitions, failing strategies because the executives who approved them are still in the room. The deeper the investment, in money, in time, in identity, the stronger the cognitive force that reframes the situation as recoverable. Not because the person has become irrational.
Because the alternative, accurate assessment, is psychologically devastating in proportion to the depth of the commitment. Leeson did not look at his position in late January 1995 and fail to understand the mathematics. He understood them perfectly. What he could not do, what the structure of human cognition made nearly impossible at that depth of commitment, was act on that understanding. Because acting on it meant simultaneously accepting that 3 years of concealment were over, that a 233-year-old institution was finished, that hundreds of colleagues were about to lose their jobs, and that he, personally, was responsible. The mind recoils from that convergence, and in recoiling, it reaches for whatever argument makes continued action possible. In January 1995, that argument was, the market will recover. It is worth noting that the market did recover. The Nikkei ended 1995 higher than it began it. Had Leeson been able to hold his positions for another 9 months, had he somehow had the capital and the time, the mathematical outcome might have been different. This is not a redemptive note. It is a structural one. The trap works because at every stage, the reasoning for staying in it is not entirely wrong. Nick Leeson received an institutional structure that made fraud possible, a cognitive architecture that made stopping impossible, and a geological event that made recovery mathematically out of reach. He made choices. They were also, in a specific sense, the choices that his situation generated for him. That is not a defense, it is a description. Barings Bank employed people who noticed the anomalies. They filed memos. The memos were received by people who were benefiting from the anomaly. The institutional incentive to look closely competed against the institutional incentive to keep cashing the receipts. The institution failed its own examination because the mechanism of that failure was also the mechanism of its profit. Here is the question I keep returning to. Leeson was 25 when the first concealment happened. The loss was £20,000. It was not his mistake. He absorbed it to protect someone else. If that single decision had gone differently, if he had reported it, absorbed the embarrassment, let the institution handle it, the chain does not begin. Which raises a question that applies well beyond Singapore in 1992. At what point in a sequence of compounding decisions is it still possible to stop? Not just financially, not just logistically, psychologically. Because if the answer is at the very beginning, before the first concealment, if the window is that narrow, then the useful insight is not about Leeson. It's about the moment before you make a decision that is locally reasonable,
personally costly to reverse and very easy to hide. That moment is the one that matters, and it almost never announces itself.